All right. So I am excited to be here today. First, I'll do a brief introduction and really excited that Nina Garek, Policy Director with Healthy and Free Tennessee, has facilitated these previous two conversations. So starting Tuesday around responsible gun ownership, and yesterday this is historical context when it comes to firearms, Black communities, the fight for liberation. And so my name is Briana Perry. My pronouns are she, her, and I am the interim executive director with Healthy and Free Tennessee. And so excited for this final conversation in this three-part series to really get into the implications of the current policies to address gun violence. And so the title, which it's so true, but it's also funny as well. Being You're not anti-gun, you're just pro-gun for police and military. And so today we're going to get into what that means exactly. And excited to have Denzel on here for a third day, and I'll allow him to introduce himself again. And just for folks who don't know, Denzel and I are engaged, and so this will be a colorful conversation. We might laugh at some points, but just to say, if it seems like we're really, comfortable and familiar with each other, we are. But yeah, I'll pass it to you, Denzel, to introduce yourself again for folks who might be tuning in for the first time.
Yeah. So thank you, Briana. So hello, everybody. My name is Denzel Caldwell, pronouns he, him, his. And I am the Sergeant of Arms for the Middle Tennessee Black Gun Club. And I am very excited to talk with Briana and the rest of y'all today about the meaning of the title for today's discussion. So.
Yeah, thank you. So yesterday, Denzel and I were talking about this historical context, which is so necessary in conversations such as this. We know language gets watered down, weaponized, histories get erased. And so as Denzel and I were talking, first wanted to start with two examples that he wanted to be sure to highlight that he didn't get to yesterday. So one, it was a piece around the crack epidemic and reflection around that, and also Tulsa riots. So just wanted to give you a chance, Giselle, to add some reflections. I know you talked about a lot yesterday with this historical piece and how firearms, were like just a tool as Black communities resisted against systemic oppression. And so just wanted to give you a chance to offer some thoughts on those two examples before we get into the full discussion today.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. Yesterday, for those who may not have been able to join, I was providing kind of like a very rough overview of the history of firearms and, in some ways, armed struggle amongst Black communities in the U.S., but also kind of put it in the international context as well. And so two of the two pieces that I wanted to lift up from yesterday that I didn't get a chance to were the Tulsa massacre. Sometimes it's referred to as the Tulsa race riot of 1921. This has been a incident, one of many incidents, I would say massacres on Black people by white mobs throughout the 20th century that has been a part of popular discourse in the past couple of years. You've seen folks, whether it be on Black History Month or depending on some incident regarding Tulsa, Oklahoma, people will bring up the Tulsa massacre or the Tulsa race riot. Among a number of things that aren't really talked about with that incident, which to my recollection began when a Black man was accused of sexually assaulting a white woman, and aggregated and turned into this large scale vigilante assault on the city of Tulsa and which led to many, many deaths and injuries. And the United States actually first bombing on U.S. territory. So there was a bombing, airplane bombing that occurred on the city that was a part of this massacre on Black people. And so one of the things I want to highlight as it relates to this discussion is that Black people fought back. It's often depicted as this story where Black people were just overwhelmingly 100% victimized. And make no mistake, it was a disaster. But it's important to note that Black people attempted to fight back. There were folks who had firearms who used those in an attempt to push back the crowd, and it led to a lot of destruction. But just wanted to include that in that larger conversation. Skipping to the 70s, yesterday I made a reference to how after the fall of the Panthers, we start to see this conservative push or this shift to the right in popular discourse and political conversations, and especially even amongst Black populations, where armed struggle is not considered or denormalized, I would say. And discouraged by this shift to the right. And so due to things such as the crack epidemic that hit the Black communities starting in the 70s and 80s, you start to see firearms in the public discourse shift away from armed struggle, from Black radical organizing to criminality, because it then gets associated with those who were selling crack on the streets, people who were drug lords, drug dealers, et cetera, et cetera. And so I want to lift that up because it's important to think about those pivots as we're getting into current conversations that overlap with conversations around gun violence, the prison system, how we respond to various forms of harm within our communities, and how the conversations around these things often get conflated. And because they are conflated, because we don't acknowledge this history of armed resistance or Black people engaging in self-defense in a collectivized manner to this day, or when we conflate that with what's happening on the streets, then the conversation becomes a soundbite, and we get soundbite public policy solutions that can lead to harmful impacts on Black communities.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you for starting there and grounding us in that history. And like you said, as we think about what's happening today, those conversations aren't in a vacuum. It's tied to this larger historical piece, and definitely want to turn us to current conversations. And if you can, just share, just like what are, these gun control debates today, and what problems you see with them as well.
Yeah. So, and this is just from my perspective. I'm just one of many, right? And so, from my perspective, what I've noticed is that, and this I think applies locally, statewide, and arguably nationally. Anytime we see conversations around gun control come up, it usually comes following a tragic incident, usually a mass shooting, or some form of gun violence. And oftentimes, understandably, people are hurt. People are devastated. Like, gun violence is devastating. There's no way around that. And so as a response, a lot of people will make demands in that moment due to the devastation, regardless of what incident that we're talking about. Mm-hmm. And many everyday people move in good faith. Like, no one wants to see violence. No one wants to see people get slaughtered and gunned down or anything like that. And so people are just like, they want it to stop. And so a lot of the popular demands call for it to stop. And because of the way, again, using that historical context and the ways that histories are erased, and there's this very binary discourse in this country around firearms, whether we're talking about liberals or neoliberals, who just talk about these idea of bans, or you have conservatives that are seeking for the least amount of regulation as it relates to firearms. The collateral damage in that are people who, for example, again, organize and may utilize firearms, for example, as a means of self-protection or community protection. We miss out on conversations around um, uh, implementation or enforcement of gun control, right? So even if we're to get and let's say a ban of a certain type of a weapon, or stricter regulations, we don't live in a vacuum. The way in which police and law enforcement enforce these things are coded by racial discrimination, by patriarchy, by ableism, most notably mental status. And so like a lot of these nuances are left out, sometimes purposefully, in these larger discourses around public policy, because our our duopoly, the two large parties have varying interests with certain policy demands. And so, yeah, gun control conversations oftentimes come down to we should ban guns, or we should just leave them alone, or the government wants to take our guns. And the reality is the conversation is a lot more expansive than that. And yeah, and oftentimes the conversations when we talk about gun violence usually focus on a particular type of gun violence, typically mass shootings. They don't, the conversation never really expands into a larger system analysis where we're asking questions around why is it that guns, the proliferation of guns, is so prevalent in this country? Why are there more guns than people? Why is it that we don't talk about police shootings when we talk about gun violence, or we talk about militaristic threats and war when we talk about gun violence? Because guns are what are being used amongst other weapons, but what are being used as a tool of war that leads to casualties in this country. So I say all that to say the conversations that typically happen with gun control, um, for the most part, are very much so simplistic and come down to whether you want to ban guns or not.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you for that. That's really helpful. And a few pieces, you mentioned collateral damage, who's collateral damage here. And you also spoke a little bit about ableism. And I want to draw that out a little more, because as we see folks rushing to solutions, not only in Tennessee, but in other places, there's this involuntary commitment piece. So definitely want to think about this disability justice perspective, dig a little more deeply into it, and think about our siblings with disabilities and how they also then become collateral damage.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that's a very important piece that comes with this conversation, because oftentimes in gun control discourse, whether we're talking about social media or even mainstream news outlets, oftentimes we find people saying, well, people with mental illnesses should not be allowed to have guns. And I mean, honestly, that's an extremely ableist statement. Very much so. Because one, it presumes that people who deal with mental health issues are all the same, as instead of the reality that it's a spectrum, right? And then on top of that, it demonizes people who struggle with mental health issues, right? It assumes that it associates people with mental health issues with violence, which is oftentimes not the case. And again, it just reinforces certain ableist tropes and public policy and realities for people who struggle with these issues, which oftentimes leads to, again, the defunding of certain mental health services that people might need to navigate their lives. And it puts people with these issues at risk, because there are people who are able to be responsible owners who at the same time may struggle with certain mental health issues, right? And when we disregard that reality, we strip them from being able to be responsible firearm owners, again, not just for the sake of owning a firearm, because we're not interested in just firearms in people's hands, but we are interested in people having a means to protect themselves, regardless of what the situation is. And so what ends up happening is you further ostracize people who are dealing with mental health issues. And again, because this is bigger than the gun, we disregard, or there's an absence of a conversation about what are the root causes that worsen or create mental health issues, right? Whether we're talking about poverty, whether we're talking about the defunding of social services, whether we're talking about the occupation of police in people's neighborhoods or areas, or whether we talk about the patriarchal culture that tends to come with obsession with guns in the U.S., we're not, or violence. We don't get to those conversations and the public policy solutions that follow that because the conversation is reduced to the firearm.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you for that. And just also want to uplift kind of like what is, at the core of this conversation, especially with thinking about folks with disabilities, it's like people's right to exist within their own bodies. And thinking about healthy and free, really pushing for reproductive justice and how core that is, right? To exist in the world, to think about self and collective determination. And so just to say that, like, that's also core to it, and how we live in a world that's inaccessible, and how that just becomes so exacerbated, when we think about these conversations around gun control, and how that really just comes out in very harmful ways and very dehumanizing ways. So appreciate you highlighting that, and want to just uplift the core of what we're talking about with these conversations as well. So Denzel, when you think about community safety, what kind of world do you envision? So think about you, but also the Middle Tennessee Black Gun Club. What kind of world are y'all trying to build? What are y'all fighting for? What are you fighting for when we think about community safety? And then also, if you want to offer a definition for folks around, like, what is community safety?
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, so I'll preface this by saying, me personally, if you haven't figured it out yet, I'm a prison abolitionist and police abolitionist, and I don't make any. I don't want that to be ambiguous whatsoever, and as well as the politics that are associated with that. So I'll start off with speaking to myself as far as the vision, and then we'll talk about the club, and then we'll get into definitions of community safety. Um, I personally am seeking to build a world that is warless, environmentally affirming, or harmonious with with nature, a prisonless democratic world where all communities have full access to clean water, healthy foods, comprehensive transportation, high quality housing, globally conscious education, and comprehensive healthcare, where the things we need to live are not a commodity. So whether we're talking about housing, whether we're talking about food, water, shelter, transportation, clean environments, I'm very clear that, like, we cannot exist to live a completely liberated and free world. We cannot exist in a world where those things have a dollar or are a basis for profit for anyone. So that's the world that I'm trying to get. In particular, being Black, I want to live in a world where Black children are not adultified, where they're not treated as threats, where they're able to live a childhood and aren't forced into adulthood. I want to live in a world where Black women are not sexually objectified or subject to patriarchal violence. wherever they go, and they're free to roam the world. I want to live in a world where Black queer folks are not at the risk of dying or being violated based on existing, right? Or people discrediting their existence. And I want to live in a world where everyone across the board is able to live full lives, where people's lives are not cut short by violence of any sort, where people are able to die after living a very, very long life with their family, with the support of their community, things like that. So I'm very clear personally what the world that I want to live and want to build. And the work we do as a club is a part of that. And so particularly as the club, as Middle Tennessee Black Gun Club, our mission is to build or promote and be a source of education for Black communities in Middle Tennessee, as well as our partners and folks who are with us that may occupy other genders. But our primary focus is educating Black communities in Middle Tennessee on the importance of firearm safety and responsible ownership. We want to promote the knowledge or increase the competency in life essential saving skills. So I talked about this in the first episode where I said life essential skills include first aid, stop the bleed or where you learn to stop life-threatening bleeds, de-escalation, which we would argue is the most important skill, and situational awareness. And these are the things that we want to promote before we start talking about the use of firearms, right? Because you're more likely to deal with a cut or a life-threatening issue with your family or friends or loved ones before you're likely to get into a firefight. Right. But when we talk about firearms, we want to also promote responsible ownership, people being very aware and constantly studying state and federal law and how they shift over time as it relates to firearm ownership. We want to make sure people are training with their firearm and also their bodies as well. We really want to promote physical fitness because the firearm is an extension of your body. And so, we want to do that and make it a part of your lifestyle. We want people to not only invest in and train in these things for their own self, but we also want people to do that as a means of protecting their communities, right? Which kind of goes into our idea of community safety. One of the things I like to say personally and share with people is that self-defense is a practice of bodily autonomy. If we want to live in a world where people's bodies and boundaries are respected, self-defense in so many ways is the practice of maintaining that respect, maintaining those boundaries, right? And that doesn't always have to look like combating violence with violence, right? Self-defense could also mean ensuring people have what they need to eat, or that they have housing, that they have the essential needs, that they have care and someone to listen to them. It's not always focused just on firefighting or hand-to-hand combat or things like that, but it does include that. Right. And so just like some of my folks in the gun club said, particularly as an organization, the Middle Tennessee Gun Club aligns itself with a part of the larger Black firearms tradition, or the Black self-defense tradition that goes back to the continent of Africa, the western central coast of Africa, through the Atlantic, down through the Americas, into this present day. And so, and also I just want to reiterate too, we do not identify as a Second Amendment organization because of that history and because we understand that the purpose of that Second Amendment, in addition to protecting this empire, was to suppress our ancestors when they rebelled on the plantations, and also used to quell other people-based movements. So.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you for that. One, I want to say, and again, continue to make these connections that vision is reproductive justice, right? As I think about the tenets of reproductive justice, the right to have a child, not to have a child, and the human right, across the board. And the last tenet, the human right to parent those children in safe, thriving communities. And so, just wanted to bring it back to reproductive justice and alignment with that, but also personally, this part of the reason why Denzel and I together, we're very aligned with our visions. And then I also want to make a note too around physical fitness. We think about that expansively. Want to name that too. Want to consider folks' abilities, but also that we're not upholding like a white supremacist understanding of physical fitness and BMI and all that. So
Right.
one as well. So with that vision, Denzel, and something that Healthy and Free has been thinking about in some coalition spaces, like we hold to that vision, and we're thinking about interventions that we can make today to move us along to that vision, and like that vision being what anchor us. It's what anchors us in our work, and as we think about accountability as well. So holding that vision as an anchor, and thinking about different solutions out there. I want to ask what you see as the real solutions to gun violence, or the real interventions that we can make when it comes to gun violence. And so it's maybe a little bit tied to the previous question, but also if there are different policy recommendations you want to name here, I want to invite that as well.
Yeah. So what I'll do is I'll kind of start with kind of like the groundwork, or the sort of theoretical groundwork, and then get into the policy. I think it's important, in summary, we have to connect the problem of gun violence with larger structural issues that we're facing, and larger issues that are happening here. So when we think about guns, we have to think about the manufacturers. We have to think about the larger industry of war that exists, not only here in the United States, but across the planet, right? So we can't be critical of gun violence when it is happening in our communities or in our local areas, whether that be city or state or even national. But we also have to think about, as being a part of the United States, what does it mean to combat gun violence or any form of variation of that on other continents that is enacted by us as a country, or enacted by the country through the military, right? So what that looks like attaching calls for ending gun violence to calls to end military intervention in the global South. And when I say the global South, I'm referring to Africa, Asia, the Far East, like just like in South America, right? It also looks like being able to be critical, people developing policy demands and calls to action that are holding to account these industries, these military industrial complex, and the industries that are associated with these people. So it's one thing to talk about manufacturers of guns such as Glock and Smith and Wesson and all these other people, but you also want to talk about, again, part of this larger conversation. You want to make sure that you bring up places like Raytheon. You want to make sure you want to bring up other companies that are responsible for being a part of this larger industry of war, right? Because these are tools of war that we're talking about, right? So what does that look like on the local level, right? We're talking, again, conversations around firearms are usually focused on interpersonal violence or mass shootings or things of that sort. I think we have to look at what's currently true, right? The reality is that there people, in order for people to get a firearm, you have certain qualifications that you have to meet in order to purchase one. Here in Tennessee, when you go to a firearm store, You have to go through a background check in the store, and then you fill out certain paperwork that it shows that you qualify, make certain qualifications to meet those needs, to be able to own a firearm. And then you're able to take it home with you. No requirement for training, no necessity or requirement to get a concealed carry permit. And one thing I'll note too, there are not readily available courses or resources, or I'll say courses, that encourage people to learn about state and federal law, right? So part of what we could think about, just from a responsible gun ownership perspective, what if we create legislation that puts money towards uh, people and institutions that teach community-wide courses or spread educational information around state law and federal law around firearm ownership as well as self-defense, right? Because this is what people are concerned about as well. So that people, whether you own a firearm or not, are able to get a readily available resource for learning how these laws work, and maybe every so often, maybe a couple years, being able to update that information because legislation changes, right? So having supporting or subsidizing gun clubs like ourselves or other firearm institutions to provide that information, and be able to share it with our constituents. We want part of what we talk about a lot in the gun club is making training a part of your lifestyle. The reality is when it comes to firearms writ large in this country, training is not as normal as we would like it to be, which is part of the reason a lot of gun-related accidents, violence, is self-inflicted. And when I say self-inflicted, I'm referring to people not properly utilizing their firearm in a way till it leads to them injuring themselves, right? So maybe in a public policy conversation, what would it look like to offer like incentives for people to go through a certain amount of like training and repeatedly, because this is training something that you have to do consistently as a part of your lifestyle. So what if we incentivize training again through organizations like ourselves or through other institutions that have qualified trainers, so that people who do decide to own a firearm, or even those who don't, could be aware of what proper usage, ownership, and safety looks like, right? And so if we can do that, if we start there, where people learn about what's happening, and what is true legally, what is true in terms of proper training and safety, then I think it's very much so easier for us to get into these larger conversations around the violence itself. We're able to say, okay, now that we know what proper ownership, what the current laws say, and how they currently fall in terms of implementation, why are these things happening, right? Why is it that this mass shooting occurred? Why is it that there's police violence or police shootings are occurring in this way? Why is it that interpersonal violence is happening? Which will give us room again to get into policy conversations around things like defunded social services, things like communities being deeply impoverished and housing being almost impossible to have, or food apartheids. Notice I'm not saying food deserts, but food apartheids. Getting into, we're talking about reproductive justice, getting into the healthcare needs for our bodily functions, right? Getting into those conversations. This is a naturally overlapping conversation that gets into a lot of other front lines, right? And so I think by focusing on public policy that incentivizes and encourages people who, just people generally, but especially people who own, to train regularly and to also receive education in essential life-saving skills like stop the bleed, like first aid, like de-escalation, then I think we'll be able to capture that group of, or really be able to capture the large discourse around firearms and get into more surgical conversations around these larger systemic issues that are oftentimes blocked by immediate reactions to gun violence and the lack of education across the board, whether you own a firearm or not.
Yeah, thank you for that, Giselle. A few things come to mind. So one, wanted to just point out, like, you turning us to thinking about violence expansively.
Mhm.
And so, like, these tragedies emerge. It's kind of like, oh, we only can think about violence in one way and not thinking about the conditions and the systems that are continuing um, to perpetuate violence, and especially within our communities, and then also, like, from that, I know we've talked about this before, that sometimes we like align with solutions, we think are solutions, to gun violence that don't even align or make sense when it comes to the functionality of how guns work and different types of guns, and so that's something too, but that there is space, and that's one thing that I want to uplift, because there's something that really comes up, and I know different folks who've been impacted by gun violence and the real hurt and trauma, and we can hold that and also hold and point our attention to, like, these systems that continue to perpetuate violence, that we should be thinking about, and going back to that vision, that if we, like, work toward that and lean into that, but always thinking about, like, the roots, system wise, or how, like, that then manifests with like interpersonally, as well. And then also, again, there's space to be real and holding the real emotions, right, that come from maybe it's like something within community, or also like something that happens on a mass level, but then, like, even with that, like, still thinking about the root. So I appreciate that framing. So as we head into this special session, and so for
Mhm.
folks who don't know, there are times when the Tennessee legislature holds special sessions to, focus on a specific issue that comes up. And so there's one that's upcoming, that's supposedly around public safety, and a lot of things that are, going to potentially come out of that conversation. And again, going back to, like, how it could, be harmful, what comes out of it. And so I wanted to ask you, Giselle, what should Tennesseans consider in preparation for this upcoming special session? What should folks know about it, or be, kind of keeping in their minds as it comes up?
Yeah, yeah. So, like, quite a bit of things. One, I definitely want to lead with some of the things that was brought up. And actually, before I do that, I do want to acknowledge some of the comments in here. I think 3481NG. I really appreciate your response about, like, again, it's something I unite with, like, making things like de-escalation readily available across the state. And essential life-saving skills. I that's something we really encourage. Which kind of goes into the immediate thing. Like, I definitely want us to think about more affirmative public policy demands, right? So what does it look like for us to go into the special session saying, hey, why don't we create programs and allocate money towards expanding Tennesseans' understanding of current state and federal law, understanding of or creating resources or incentivizing people who already teach these skills, like essential life-saving skills, like the Middle Tennessee Black Gun Club, to push to have readily available courses and material on de-escalation on stopping the bleed, on first aid, CPR, AED, on situational awareness, on the basics of firearm safety and responsible ownership. If we talk about incentivizing those things and creating programs that promote safety, right, then I think we're able to create a basis for more competent, more precise uh, uh, abilities of Tennesseans to get to the root of the violence, right? And when I say violence, I'm thinking about it expansively, which ultimately goes back to state violence and larger systems violence that manifests interpersonally or on a community level, right? So like really advocating for those things, for creation and expansion of de-escalation, first aid, stop the bleed, basic handgun safety, and just awareness across the state. I also want to challenge, because, I'm going to be honest, I want to challenge certain popular demands right now, particularly one relating to what's popularly termed red flag laws. For those who don't know, red flag laws are extreme order protection laws, are laws that would give certain people named in legislation the ability to alert law enforcement when someone is deemed a threat to the community, particularly if they own firearms. There has been legislation that has been put forth or at least drafted. I think it's called the Protect Kids Not Guns Act that in addition to it having a ban or a call for essentially a gun ban, it also has this variation of what we're referring to as red flag laws. Mm-hmm. Now, in this legislation, the way that it works is people such as your relatives, people who live with you or used to live with you, people who have been in a relationship with you, people who are your relatives or law enforcement would have the ability to report to a court or to law enforcement that they feel that somebody is a threat with their firearms, and the courts and law enforcement will have to go through a particular process to essentially approve an extreme risk protection order, after which police and law enforcement would have the ability to go into someone's home after notification and seize their possessions. In this case, firearms, and then it would be on the and this would be temporary initially for a fixed time period, but the person who is subject to that seizure will have the ability, at least on paper, to go to court and appeal it. And the burden of proof will actually be on them to demonstrate they're not a danger. I want people to be a little very critical of this. One, because again, as I talked about before, law enforcement and even how we perceive danger is not neutral. Mm-hmm. And very much so informed by, these systems of oppression. Again, anti-Blackness, ableism, patriarchy, these things of this sort. And so I also want us to think about the ways in which this could put certain people in danger. Mm-hmm. Right. Oftentimes, when I hear people talk about or critical of this type of law, I'm also hearing those same people who are critical of the Department of Child Services, right? And how the ways in which families are stripped or separated from their children and things of that sort. And it's very much so likened to that. And so I think that I would challenge people to think of more like critical ways that we can keep our folks safe who are in danger, in real danger, right? Whether it be domestic violence, whether it be someone who is creating an abusive condition in their household. And think about it in ways that doesn't end up putting more Black people, for example, in danger because they're perceived as a threat. And so as a result, this law is weaponized against them.
And I don't know if you see in the chat, someone mentioned that like the bill version in Tennessee only allows the police to do this filing. So just to say,
wow.
Like oh, like who is it, what is this really about? And so just to wanted to uplift that, because that's something to point out, right? That like, oh,
Mhm.
so more power to the police, and
Yeah.
what is, right, and the impact of that.
Yeah. Yes, and to be honest, like this is also a challenge to those who are um, on the left, particularly those who are interested in participatory budgeting, who are interested in budgets, state on city level, reallocating funds to social services and away from these bloated police budgets. I want you to think about that as we think through these red flag laws, because if this is passed and this empowers police to be able to do that, that is going to be justification for more funding, right? And so just want to be very critical of that, and think about how that impacts other policy demands, because again, none of our policy demands live in a vacuum.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but yeah, outside of that, honestly, I would just really, really emphasize people to think about and to advocate for the expansion of education, educational programs and services that include de-escalation, that include stop the bleed, first aid, AED, that include training people in understanding how firearms work, mainly because they're here, just as a practical reality that they're not going to disappear, and how to navigate them safely, and the steps that it takes to be a responsible owner, responsible not only to yourself but to those around you. Yeah, and supporting people who do that work already. Again, Middle Tennessee Black Gun Club is one organization where we do that. So creating programs where we're in partnership and providing community programs and education for people across Tennessee, so that people can not only develop more competency around the firearm and the function, but also the devastating impact, and also the root of the violence that is prevalent in our communities, that not only exists on an interpersonal level, but exists on larger national and international levels, right? So that's what I would say.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for that, Denzel, and pointing us to the organizations that we should be following, and we'll make sure to include that when we post the video link. Always pointing our attention back to the root causes, and when we think about these policies, how we are, very mindful and thorough in our research, and thinking about the impact. Like, these are the communities that will be impacted, as we think about this little, like, quote unquote win. But like, these are the communities who will continue to experience devastation, who will continue to be policed, etc. And going back, always to the root. So we've enjoyed having you
Thank
on, you and Naya, for past 3 days, and we'll continue to do these conversations. Like, we know that this has been a topic, but along with other topics, and really want to uplift those who are thinking about this every day, right? Who are doing this incredible work in our communities, who understand, like, the interconnectedness of so much and the nuances. And so really wanted to highlight that with this series, and just so grateful to you and Tanea for doing it. So thank you all for tuning in. Like I said, we'll be sure to continue to drop the links when we share this video. And yeah, thank you, Denzel. I love you, and
you.
conversation.
All right, thank you. All right, y'all.
Bye.